Good morning, Mr. Speaker, and good morning to my colleagues on the other side of the House. Mr. Speaker, it is certainly my profound honor to rise this morning to commence the parliamentary opposition's contributions to the 2022 budget debate in this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, I must note at the outset that I was disturbed that the parliamentary opposition was only given 2 working days to consider these voluminous estimates. Mr. Speaker, we on this side, we suspect that the government is quite sure that Budget 2022 will not stand up to robust scrutiny. Last year, Mr. Speaker, I stood in this honorable House and I described the 2021 budget as vapid, vacuous, and visionless. And I stand here 1 year later, Mr. Speaker, to testify as to the accuracy of that description. But, Mr. Speaker, I do not take pride in my prognostication because I'm cognizant of the biblical admonition that says, where there is no vision, the people perish. And the people of Guyana, Mr. Speaker, are perishing. Mr. Speaker, 1 year later, Guyana has, for all intents and purposes, lost the battle against COVID-19. Today, as a nation of less than 800,000, these are the statistics. We have 1,166 deaths, 353 new cases within the last 24 hours, a total confirmed case load of close to 60,000 and a whopping 11,234 persons on home isolation. These are the stats. And we have a health minister who is in a perpetual state of suspicion. He is never sure. He simply surmises and suspects. Mr. Speaker, inflation stands close to 6%. It is a daily struggle for most to find one meal a day. Crime is rampant, corruption is rife, and with each announcement of an oil fine, Mr. Speaker, Guyanese sink deeper and deeper into despair and discouragement. What is in it for me? Charlene from behind the stall or stall on board the market asks, what is in it for me? What is there to be excited about? Shalita says I can't eat oil. She says it's a daily struggle to send my children to school, to find 2 meals per day to help them to focus. Imagine I have to pay $300 for a pound of plantain. Chicken is $400 per pound. Fish, Bangamary, is $450 a pound. I am a cleaner and my husband works on a fishing boat. But guess what? He was laid off recently because the boss man said they just don't have enough fish and he got to close down operations. Shalita says, I hope that the government, that they do something for we in this 2022 budget. This is what Shalita says. Enter stage right, Mr. Speaker, budget 2022. The most disrespectful, discriminatory, and deceitful budget to ever grace the floor of this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, my late mother, God bless her soul, used to tell me, show me where you spend your money and I will tell you what you value and what your values are. Mr. Speaker, the minister with responsibility for finance stood in this House and told the people of Guyana that in 2021 inflation was close to 6%. And food inflation, the food price inflation in particular, was approximately 12%. Yet, Mr. Speaker, this government has given to our public servants a meager 5% after tax increase over a period of 2 years. 5%, Mr. Speaker. The PPPC refused to give Guyanese an increase that would at least help them to meet the increased cost in food that they need to survive. That is how much they care. Mr. Speaker, show me where you spend your money and I will tell you what you value. Mr. Speaker, out of a budget of 553 billion, the PPP chose to spend 218 billion on capital expenditure, an approximate increase of over 109%. Mr. Speaker, look, the issue that arises here immediately is capacity. It is well known, well established, that neither the central government nor the private sector has the capacity, neither of them. They have the capacity to execute such a massive increase in this program. In the ordinary scheme of things, this is when everything is going as it should. Mr. Speaker, this lack of capacity is exacerbated by the fact that we are in a pandemic, sir, and the minister with responsibility for finance stood in this house and said to us that there are serious issues with the global supply chain. We heard all manner and sorts of excuses that these issues with the global supply chain have affected the ability to complete CJIA and the Mandela Road extension project. When one considers, Mr. Speaker, that the foreign component of our public sector investment program is about 70%, meaning we got to import almost everything to get the work done, how is it that the government intends to execute such a massive infrastructure program within a year? And not even in a year, sir, it's going to be 10 months by the time this budget is passed and the system starts to work. Mr. Speaker, the IMF, in reporting on Guyana's public sector investment management assessment, said this. It said that Guyana has an estimated efficiency gap of 41%. 41%, Mr. Speaker. When that statistic is applied here, what it means is that out of the $218 billion allocated for CapEx, $8 to $9 billion of that will be wasted as a result of the weaknesses in planning, in budgeting, in appraisal, in selection, in procurement, and in the execution of capital projects. $8 to $9 billion Guyana dollars, sir. These are not our stats. These are the stats according to the IMF. Mr. Speaker, we know the IMF in its diplomacy will not say corruption, but we know what they mean. They mean corruption. And we know that we have fallen 2 places in 2 years on the transparency index, on the transparency corruption index. So we beg and we understand what they mean. Mr. Speaker, I say this to you. If this government were truly serious about putting Guyana on a sound developmental footing, they would have expended efforts on decreasing that efficiency gap to minimize wastage. Mr. Speaker, they would focus on investing in our human capital and on training, and not just on training, but on offering competitive remuneration, lest we be training our people to leave. Mr. Speaker, given this anticipated wastage of 89 billion, Mr. Speaker, and all of these issues that I referred to earlier, the supply chain issues, the pandemic issues, Mr. Speaker, it is highly unlikely that with the most strenuous of efforts, this government will be unable to execute such a program. Mr. Speaker, why not therefore reallocate, rearrange? If we could minimize, if we could prevent, let me say 50% of this wastage by doing a proper adjustment and coming to this house with a more realistic figure. Mr. Speaker, if we are to take $36 billion, which represents, sir, a 6.5% of this budget, 6.5%. Mr. Speaker, this is what we can do with this 36 billion. We can give the 50,000 public servants a pay raise of 10% right now. We can provide tuition, free tuition for 11,000 university students right now. Mr. Speaker, we could give the 9,000 plus health workers an average of a $250,000 bonus right now. Mr. Speaker, we can raise the income tax threshold to 100%. to $100,000 rather right now. Mr. Speaker, we can increase the old age pension to $35,000 a month for the 65,000 senior citizens Mr. Speaker, we can allocate a $3.5 billion allocation on technical and vocational educational training. Mr. Speaker, we could provide $2 million in business grants to 2,000 qualified small businesses right now, Mr. Speaker. And guess what we could do, Mr. Speaker? We could spend $1.3 billion to upscale those 5,000 plus sugar workers, to train them for a future beyond sugar, instead of keeping them tied and tethered to an industry that you yourself came to this house and said is failing. That is what we could do, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, all of this could be done right now, and CapEx would still stand at 75%. Can you imagine the difference this would make, Mr. Speaker, to the lives of ordinary Guyanese? But show me where you put your money, and I will tell you what you value and where your values are. Mr. Speaker, this government boasts about $25 billion in relief measures. But, sir, the truth is that by and large, those measures are geared towards favoring big business. Mr. Speaker, it appears as if the government keeps hoping that by providing all of these tax breaks to big businesses, that the benefits will trickle down to the poor and the working class. Mr. Speaker, we fed up tell them, the world over fed up tell them, trickle down economics don't work. Mr. Speaker, a case in point is that last year, August, this government adjusted the freight cost component of the CIF, and the effect of which was to roll back pre-freight costs. Yet in November, Mr. Speaker, we had the highest office holder in this land begging the private sector to pass the savings on. Mr. Speaker, they acknowledge that it doesn't work. And guess what they do, Mr. Speaker? Instead of allocating properly, instead of rearranging, they continue this tax break until 2022 at a cost of $6 billion to the poor and the working class Guyanese, Mr. Speaker. Show me where you spend your money, and I will show you what you value. Mr. Speaker, let us forget about all of the propaganda and the acrobatics in linguistics that the minister with responsibility for finance he performed. The reality is the numbers don't lie. The numbers tell a story, and the story that the numbers is telling is that this government do not care. The government does not care for the poor and working class. This is why, Mr. Speaker, they have no interest in strengthening the national procurement framework. Mr. Speaker, I was appalled to hear the minister with responsibility for finance accuse the AP and UFC of systematically dismantling the procurement system. I sat here and I wondered how much of a frolic in delusion could we embark upon. Mr. Speaker, we will remind the PPP administration that it was the AP and the UAFC that constituted the Public Procurement Commission a decade after it was implemented into our Constitution. They refused to perfect the legal framework, and you dare to come here today to tell us that we have dismantled it. You continue to systematically undermine our procurement system. It was you that appointed the head of the PSIP as the chair of the National Tender Administration, in direct conflict with the act which said that the chair and the deputy chair must be full-time employees, and you dare to come into this house to say what? So, Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Finance does not get...
Honorable Member, I didn't dare to do anything, so please.
Thank you, sir. The Minister with responsibility for finance. It is so tedious to have to say that. I don't know why they just don't make it the Minister of Finance and done. But anyway, the Minister with responsibility for finance stood in this house and accused us of the act that they themselves are guilty of, demonstrably guilty of. They have fired, Mr. Speaker, all of the properly qualified and trained personnel at MPTAB because they perceive them to have a particular type of political affiliation. Mr. Speaker, he does not get to come here and engage in revisionism. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn my attention very briefly to this natural resource fund. I note that you have made some pronouncements, sir, on the illegality or otherwise of the actions. Mr. Speaker, I will say that it appears that you have already come to the conclusion that our actions were illegal, and therefore it appears to me at this time that our appearance before a privileges committee might be moot. Mr. Speaker, I want to say that the Natural Resource Fund bill, this bill, sir, received outcry far and wide from the Guyanese public. Everybody and the grandmother said, look, consult. They said consult. Yet the government sought to use its one-seat majority to force that legislation down Guyanese people's throats. But Mr. Speaker, with their usual propaganda, they came here, they went to the public and assured us of all types of things. They said, oh, there will be the greatest levels of transparency and it will be subject to parliamentary scrutiny. Mr. Speaker, I am yet to hear clearly articulated in this budget what projects will be funded by this money that they took out of the NRF. What projects will be funded by it, sir? We don't know. We just know that with the money. We don't know where it's going. We don't know where it's at. We know nothing. The first foray out into a budgeting cycle with this money available, and they have failed to deliver the promised level of transparency to the Guyanese people, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is unacceptable. This is the patrimony of our generation and the generation after ours. And the PPPC administration does not be allowed to trifle with it. Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House, we continue to maintain that the Natural Resources Fund Act as passed by the coalition, sir, provided robust transparency. It provided, sir, a level of transparency that has been taken out of this current bill, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will give you an example. In the 2019 Act, we specifically said that when it came to the annual budget proposals for projects to be funded from this NRF, that a statement explaining how the withdrawal from the fund for the next ensuing fiscal year and for each of the next following 3 fiscal years shall be used to finance national development priorities. We said it because we were serious about it, and we were so serious about it that we were committed to reducing it into law, Mr. Speaker. That provision has been taken out of this present bill. And so, Mr. Speaker, there is no duty binding this government to put those monies towards our urgent developmental priorities. But I suspect they want to use it for budget support. I suspect that they want to use it to finance this big debt that they're incurring. Mr. Speaker, today we stand in this House and we can tell you where this $127 billion from the fund is going to be expended. I guess, therefore, Mr. Speaker, we can put the rhetoric of transparency soundly to bed. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn my attention to foreign relations. I don't even know where to start with you, Todd. I don't even know where to start. Look, Mr. Speaker, since our
Honorable member.
Honorable Member Todd, I'm not sure where to begin with you, sir. I will say, Mr. Speaker, that since our independence, Guyana has always been able to punch above its weight class in foreign policy because we had exemplary leadership on the global stage. Mr. Speaker, we were buoyed by a well-trained cadre of professional diplomats and foreign service officers. Mr. Speaker, the foreign policies of Forbes Burnham, of Desmond Hoyt, and of Dr. Chetty Jagan were clear, they were decisive, they were coherent, and they were rooted in incontrovertible principles. Mr. Speaker, these leaders had similar foreign policies that were rooted in national sovereignty, in non-interference in internal affairs, in non-alignment, in multilateralism, in equality among states, in economic independence, and an unwavering support to the right to self-determination. Mr. Speaker, Guyana's ideals were clear and the nations of the world knew exactly where we stood. Mr. Speaker, those glory days of Guyana's diplomacy were characterized by a professional diplomatic corps. We had a judicious mind at the helm of the foreign ministry. And we had a president who possessed the power, both de jure and de facto, to make decisions on behalf of this nation. Mr. Speaker, a relatively small state was seen as a towering example of diplomacy. Mr. Speaker, today all of them gone. Mr. Speaker, all of the aforementioned are absent. Since August 2nd, 2020, my lord, our foreign policy has become nebulous, incoherent. It has become fleeting and transactional. We have seen Guyana stumble and our reputation severely tarnished on the international stage. From a senior official having difficulty pronouncing two-syllable words to another one talking about orgasms on the international stage. Mr. Speaker, this is where we are. Our important policy announcements are emanating from foreign policies and from foreign embassies instead of from Tacuba Lodge. Mr. Speaker, we have ships flying our gold in our head on the high seas and engaged in all manner and sort of illegalities. Mr. Speaker, now look, this most recent embarrassment of rogue vessels flying our flag has dire implications for our nation and for our relationship with our allies. Mr. Speaker, this administration continues to demonstrate their incompetence to conduct our foreign affairs, to maintain law and order, and to meet our obligations under international treaties. Mr. Speaker, what is worse, their attempts to distance themselves from the debacle is indicative of their lack of appreciation of one fundamental principle of international law, that while you may delegate a function, you cannot divest yourself of the responsibility. But you see, them in order, Mr. Speaker. Them in order. Mr. Speaker, it is widely known that the Foreign Affairs Ministry has been wantonly politicized and now operates at the whims and fancies and caprices of ministerial administration. What is worse, we're not even sure if it's the whims and fancies and caprices of the minister that actually sit in there. But, Mr. Speaker, recently there was a recall of a number of senior and seasoned foreign service officials from postings all around the world. And these officers, sir, have been by and large replaced with junior officers. Mr. Speaker, without enough of an overlap time to allow for these officers to be properly mentored and oriented. And this has resulted, Mr. Speaker, in a lack of leadership and in confusion at a number of our diplomatic missions abroad. Mr. Speaker, we need to invest in a professional foreign service. One is a cadre of people, sir, that are well trained, that can adequately promote our national interests abroad. Mr. Speaker, in order to achieve this, the coalition, whilst in office, established the Bertram Collins College of the Public Service and re-establish the Foreign Services Institute in order to educate a core of competent professional diplomats and public servants to advance our interests abroad. The first order of business of the administration was to shut down the college, Mr. Speaker, and I will ask Mr. Todd to point out to me the exact allocation for the Foreign Services Institute. Mr. Speaker, the world over is aware that de jure, Guyana has a head of state. However, Mr. Speaker, one is not assured that the final decision-making powers lie with the head of state. And Mr. Speaker, one of the hazards of that perception is that such a nation is seen as perennially weak. So that scenario that I have pointed out, Mr. Speaker, That backdrop that I have painted, that is the backdrop against which the minister with responsibility for finance has come into this house to state these lofty ideals in terms of our foreign relations. Mr. Speaker, I dare say that all of the intentions outlined by the minister can be attempted with the most strenuous of efforts, but the chances of success are minimal, sir, due to the problematic macro structures that I've just outlined. Mr. Speaker, a structured and well thought out foreign policy comprises three key things: conception, content, and implementation. And all of this, sir, is influenced and shaped by the realities of the outside world. Mr. Speaker, our policy makers are therefore expected to pursue certain goals while ensuring that the nation's self-interests are maintained and preserved. Mr. Speaker, given Guyana's new role as a petroleum producer, with whom much geopolitical and strategic interests now lie, have we reimagined our foreign policy with this in mind? In the context of a complex and a highly interdependent world, a new oil and gas economy needs a foreign ministry that is as ethical as possible and furnished with some of the best brains that the country has to offer. Mr. Speaker, this is arguably one of our most important ministries. And to this end, sir, this meeting and the knocking of glasses and the photo ops and the smiles and the hugs and the propagandistic headlines will not suffice. Mr. Speaker, we must reignite our foreign policy imagination, and we must ensure that every encounter results in the preservation of good neighborliness. Mr. Speaker, the nation observed the visit of the President of Suriname, but this government could not articulate the strategic interests of this meeting. There was no transparency. In fact, since the 2nd of August 2020, this nation's foreign policy has been conducted with the greatest of contempt for the people of Guyana. Visiting dignitaries, sir, are not even given the opportunity to meet with the opposition. Deals are signed. We do not know what they are trading away, but deals are signed, and nobody knows what is contained in those agreements. Everything is opaque, and everything is secretive. But I must say, Mr. Speaker, outside of this very credible critique that I've just offered, we welcome visits by foreign dignitaries that advance our interests. We cannot argue with any effort to open foreign missions that seek to advance our cause. Mr. Speaker, the government has said that it will focus on deepening relations with the member states of CARICOM. We welcome this, Mr. Speaker, and we warn that we must guard against exuberance and eschewing our regional integration principles because we are now an oil-producing economy. We should stick steadfastly to the principles which lead to the creation of CARICOM, which led, in fact, sir, to the creation of CARICOM. Mr. Speaker, but again, in the absence of a consistent policy on integration, we continue to sail along like a rudderless ship. Today we demand visas for Haitian brothers and sisters. Tomorrow we trade words with the Trinidadians. And then we come into the house and we talk about deepening CARICOM relations. Mr. Speaker, there is no consistency in our foreign policy. Mr. Speaker, Guyana's sovereignty and territorial integrity remains sacrosanct. Accordingly, Mr. Speaker, there is no distance between the government and the political opposition on this issue. It is the David Granger-led administration that initiated the judicial route to resolve this issue, and the present government has continued on this trajectory. We reaffirm that the border claim by Venezuela is opportunistic, it is mischievous, it is without merit, and we are confident that Guyana will be vindicated. Mr. Speaker, in September 2020, I stood in this house and I cautioned that we have much to gain, and we have gained much by establishing ourselves as a reliable partner in regional and hemispheric stability, and that it would be unwise to depart from that. Mr. Speaker, that caution remains. In September 2020, I urged the Minister of Public Works that priority must be given to a maritime spatial plan. I urge the commissioning of a national maritime and port sector plan, which would chart the course of the development of that sector, particularly because we are now an oil-producing economy. Mr. Speaker, to this day, nothing, Mr. Speaker. Outside the fact that in respect to our ports, we seem to be doing planning by fire. Nothing, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member, I have to tell you something. You need to get an extension to conclude.
Thank you, my good sir. I do move that the honorable member be given 5 minutes to conclude our presentation.
You don't move, but you're moving a motion that she gets 5 minutes to conclude.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Honorable member, please continue to conclude.
I'd be delighted to continue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I will wrap up on that note. Mr. Speaker, one of the many disappointing aspects of Budget 2022 was the lack of focus on global warming and hinterland resettlement. Mr. Speaker, coastal portions of Guyana sit from 19.7 inches or 0.5 meters to 39.4 inches or 1 meter below sea level. Guyana is particularly vulnerable to sea level rise stemming from climate change, plus the regional shifts, sir, in the height of the sea. Mr. Speaker, close to 80% of Guyana's population live in the low-lying coastal areas. Guyana's capital city of Georgetown relies on seawalls for protection. The narrow coastal plain is home to almost all the country's agricultural production, which is critical to both our food security and our export. Mr. Speaker, climate change and rising sea levels and poor irrigation and sea defenses have left the coastal residents at the mercy of the weather and the sea. Mr. Speaker, flooding is now commonplace. The flooding in 2021, sir, destroyed billions of dollars in livestock, in farmlands and personal property, and it should have been a wake-up call for this government to act, Mr. Speaker. But instead, as the waters receded, so did any sense of urgency. Mr. Speaker, the time has come for our leaders to engage the population on the conversation of moving to high ground. We must, sir, engage our population. We must have a debate, sir, on the wisdom of continuing to restrict our development and major infrastructure to the coast. We must have a dialogue on housing, on population planning, and we must implement programs that prioritize hinterland development with the building of hinterland cities, for example, to continue to have massive development projects tabled. The ones you've seen tabled in this budget, sir, and which are on the coast, is short-sighted, and it is gambling with Mother Nature, sir. Mr. Speaker, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said that 2020, in its 2021 report, that Georgetown is listed as one of 9 cities that will be underwater by 2030, a mere 8 years from now. Despite this dire prediction, sir, we see a budget presented where over 80% of the infrastructure and agricultural development dollars are projected to be spent on the coast. Mr. Speaker, the PPPC's budget, sir, has given scant regard to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It is very clear that the PPP has no interest in ending poverty, in ending hunger, in achieving food security, in ensuring that all Guyanese have access to primary and secondary education. All you have to do, sir, is follow the money, and you will see that the budget is not geared towards making any real and lasting positive impact in ensuring Guyana's human development. Mr. Speaker, former President David Granger cautioned that Guyana cannot become one nation if gross disparities persist between the hinterland and the coastland, between the educated few and the semi-literate masses, and between the very rich and the very poor. It cannot become one nation, Mr. Speaker. The PPPC continues to give lip service to the creation of one Guyana whilst promulgating policies and programs and presenting a budget that widens the gap between the rich and the poor, between the hinterland and the coastland, and between the educated and the uneducated. Mr. Speaker, I note that the title of the budget is Steadfast Against All Challenges, resolute in building our one Guyana, Mr. Speaker. Our qualifies one, which means we are talking about the one Guyana according to the PPPC administration. Mr. Speaker, In concluding, Mr. Speaker, the PPPC has demonstrated their inability to even keep their own promises. Mr. Speaker, where is the free education that they promised in the manifesto? Where is the 50% increase for public servants? Where is the 50,000 jobs according to your Land Post manifesto? Where are the sugar estates that you have reopened? Where are the targeted cash transfers to Guyanese, particularly the elderly, the children, the poor, and the other vulnerable groups? Where are the promises in your manifesto? Why don't we see them reflected in this budget in any tangible way? You promised in your manifesto an increase of the old age pension to $40,000 per month. We just showed you how you could achieve that with the minutest of reallocation. But the fact is that you don't care. What happened to the duty-free zones? You said that you would compensate fisher folk affected by the oil and gas sector. Where is that compensation? Mr. Speaker, the PPPC administration has already demonstrated to the people of Guyana who they are. A mafia masquerading as a government, focused only on enriching themselves and their friends. But in the end, Mr. Speaker, in the end, we the people, the Guyanese people, must ask ourselves, what country do we want? Will we become a petrostate with weak institutions and wealth concentrated in the hands of a few elites? Or will we become that state that uses the proceeds from our vast resources to invest in our valuable resources, in our people? Mr. Speaker, the UN report on human development in 1990 stated that the people are the real wealth of a nation. And the basic objective of the development is to create an enabling environment for people to enjoy long and healthy, creative lives. So we, the people of Guyana, must understand that we deserve no less. We must ask ourselves, will we continue to cast nets to arrest Guyanese people on trumped-up charges? Or will we create safety nets to buttress against the socio-economic collapse of our country? Mr. Speaker, this disrespectful, discriminatory, and deceitful budget clearly ignores the importance of our people, Mr. Speaker. The truth is, sir, show me what you spend your money behind and I will show you what you value. And this budget proves beyond the shadow of a doubt that the PPPC administration, they simply do not care about the poor and the working class in Guyana. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.